Welcome back to another episode of the Abington LaunchBox Tech-umentary series. I'm Peter Hormer, the director of the Abington LaunchBox, joined by my colleague Derek Majors. Derek, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. We get to talk about now part 2 of our Tech-umentary series. So if you didn't tune into part 1, don't worry, it's on our YouTube channel. We talked about storage media and looked at all the innovations that have happened along the ages. But what are we talking about today in part 2?
So part 2 is audio. So everything to do with the journey of listening and playing back, listening to and playing back audio, and just sort of the same thing as we did last episode, just every step of the way and how the technology has evolved over the years.
Cool. So we can't go all the way back to the beginning. I mean, there were some things that we just didn't have access to, and I forgot to bring in an actual vinyl record. So you'll see the B-roll when we roll that in here. That's my fault. But that's about as far back as we could physically get our hands on. And that was one of the things we wanted to do in this series is not just talk about the history, but show it, touch it, interact with it as we went. So what we could start with is vinyl records. And let's talk about how far back that is. It's not all that far, though, when I think about it. Recorded music started, there were wax cylinders, there were all kinds of other things, but the era we're going to start with is vinyl records. So when did that process get started?
Sure. So vinyl record use began around 1948 as 33 1/3 RPM format known as LPs or long play. And those succeeded 78 RPM shellac records that could only hold 2 5-minute songs.
Mm-hmm.
So vinyls had, over the years, several different formats that held different lengths of music. And the mechanism of the sound creation was a needle vibrating along specially cut plastic grooves in the vinyl to produce vibrations that were the sounds of the music.
Right, so it was really just an amplification process, right? We weren't converting, we weren't processing. There was a needle running through a physical media that made vibrations. Those vibrations were amplified by your stereo amplifier at the time, and that's how we got to listen to music. And I don't know where you started. Have you had LPs or any records in your lifetime?
Yeah, I definitely have friends who have their own vinyl collections today. I know they're still very popular today. Nobody in my family really ever had vinyls, but I know some of my friends' parents definitely had vinyls, and I've seen them at my grandparents'.
Sure. So yeah, and I have them, and I do very firmly remember as a child, probably 5 years old, I would say, my first actual music purchases, things that I had of my own. And I do remember, I do not still have it, but I remember a 45. It was Devo, Whip It. If you remember that song from, I don't even know, my guess would be 1981, somewhere in that time frame. And I remember it being mine, and I still remember like carving my name into it because I had an older brother. I still do have an older brother. And there was just something about the physical media, knowing that this was mine. And as we progress through the ages of talking about now all the streaming things, how do you kind of own and possess anything now? But I still remember that moment being very critical for me as being a young person, creating my own kind of life and having my own things. This was the first thing that wasn't a toy. It wasn't a stuffed animal. It was the same thing that my father had, that my older brother had. And I remember that moment of carving my name into Devo Whip It.
Yeah, we'll get to this with video too in the next episode. But the concept of media ownership sort of evolves and gets abstracted as the years go on and as we get more modern.
Yeah. So records, vinyl had a nice long run from all the way up until we started then moving into magnetic media. And as we sit here in 2022, vinyl actually is making a comeback. Lots of music is still sold on vinyl. And I guess one of the concepts that we should weave in here, maybe as we start talking, is about this concept of jobs to be done. It's a concept that when we're working with businesses at the LaunchBox, we're talking about how do you add value, right? So there needs to be a job it can be done, and it should be valuable. So as you solve that problem, people say that was worth my time, energy, and hopefully money. And the thing is that as we look at all this material today, the job to be done is really listening to music. Although we can add in other things, higher fidelity, portability, accessing massive libraries. Like one of the things that if you haven't worked with vinyl records, carrying around 100 vinyl records is no small task. They are heavy, and they take up a lot of space.
Not to mention fragile.
Yeah, there's lots of problems with that. So as we go through this series, really thinking about jobs to be done and how the job to be done doesn't necessarily change all that much over time. So we're talking about things, from the 20s, 50s, all the way up through the 2020s. The job to be done hasn't changed all that much. But as you're about to see, the way those jobs are being completed and adding value have changed quite a bit over time. So moving from those fragile, heavy physical media discs made out of vinyl, moving now into a really common format for us here, magnetic media. Where did we start when we made that transition from a spinning disc of plastic to now something different?
Sure. So magnetic media, just like we discussed in the last episode, sort of got its start, and audio reels became popular in the 1950s. Yeah. And, they've been used all the way through to the modern day, very few users, but in the 90s it was a very popular hi-fi format. So it's very much still plastic, but thinner and in a long strip, just like we showed in the computer data storage video. Our example stores just a couple hours of audio.
Yeah. So about 1,200 feet, so almost a quarter mile of this mylar and plastic format that was used. And you could store about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours, depending on the speed and the quality of the recording that you were doing, and depending on the player and the recording device that you had, you might be able to change settings. Again, you might remember this from VHS eras where you had different play lengths and play speeds that would change the quality, but also would change the play time. But these reel-to-reels were never really commercially successful at selling pre-recorded media. But they became really an enthusiast favored tool because of their ability to record, re-record, and process media. But as a pre-recorded media format, never really took off. But that changed with a couple of the next steps where there was a bit more commercial success. So what came kind of in around that same time, maybe a little bit later, but a lot of these magnetic formats kind of coexisted together for a while.
Yeah. So the next big popular format was 8-track or stereo 8 tapes. Very much like a cassette, but a little bit larger at around this size. They were introduced around 1965. Much more popular and accessible than reel-to-reel. There was a lot of work to do with reel-to-reel, stringing it over to the other take-up reel, and required expensive equipment to play. But 8-track players were introduced in things like cars and were a lot more affordable. Although they were much more popular, they only held about 45 minutes of music, though.
Yeah, and they didn't really hold on all that long. So 8-track came in, they had a little bit of commercial success, particularly with the pre-recorded music, but also it was the move into putting that pre-recorded music into vehicles. And 1966, Ford Motor Company put it in their Ford Mustang, and then they started making it a generally available upgrade in vehicles. And this really, I think, helped that driving, the ecosystem where reel-to-reel just wasn't going to work in a car, made it commercially challenging for pre-recorded music. But then the contained cassette format of 8-track, I think, really then brought commercial music into that new format, and this partnership really with industry, and industry being the ones that brought the portability of pre-recorded music into their cars, made it a feature, made it actually a selling point, a profit center. in automobiles, I think really is something that changed the whole business model of music, pre-recorded music and distribution, and cassettes then really became the format that not only took over, but lasted far longer than 8 tracks.
Yeah, much like the computer data storage episode, we're seeing a long trend of making products smaller, more affordable, more compact, and more durable, especially for things like transportation like cars and walking around and jogging. And cassettes are really that next step. They also came out around in the 60s. And were even smaller than 8 tracks, better quality, still worse than reel-to-reel tape, but much more portable, obviously, and could be, taken on runs and in cars, and, stored more compactly.
Yeah, and I think the cassette really is the thing that made music a lifestyle component, right? It used to be, we've got some of these components in the back here. You can see kind of the setup where it was, you went to the music, but cassettes really made it possible where the music went with you. And whether it was in your car and driving, it really became something that you could then now travel with. And we're going to look at some of the different components in a minute that really made music a much greater part of our lifestyles and our personalities. And I think that's where you really saw things take off, and the cassette, I believe, to be one of the major components that started shifting music from a personal enjoyment that we might have done ourselves to, something that we could show and demonstrate. We don't have a boombox here, but things like the cassette boombox where you could take this to the playground, you could take your music to your friend's house. Those things really made music, I think, part of our lives a bit more.
Yeah. So, starting with reel-to-reel, you had these very large machines, could only listen at home, really. If you wanted to take it somewhere, you could, but, it wasn't done. You move on to large decks like this for cassettes. As you can see, there's a cassette in here right now. But then, the move came to even smaller playback devices, like this one here, and even smaller still through the 90s. This is a Walkman from the 90s, where it even had features like skipping songs and limiting tape hiss, and generally improving quality and listening experience.
Yeah, and again, that it also made it accessible from a price set, right? So, when we were looking at some of these major components and things like reel-to-reel players and recorders, major tape decks, amplifiers, this was an investment. Hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, and we're talking 1970s and 80s. These were major investments that were made. And then as we progressed through time, things like the Walkman, these became things that teenagers could have. My guess would be, did you have one of these as a teenager, or you're too young for that too? So I had one as a teenager. I'll just say that.
I had a Discman.
All right, so that's okay, but similar. But this is something that then became accessible. So now we're talking about the accessibility of these things was not something that you needed to have a large amount of space. You needed to have some technical know-how to hook all the components together, inputs, outputs, not that complicated, but still not a thing that you could hand off to an 11 or 12-year-old. They could put a tape in, press play, and they had their own music. And that's, again, the job that needed to be done was people wanted to listen to music. But now we made it more accessible, we made it more affordable, more portable, and now you're adding value, not necessarily because the job to be done has changed, but we now allow people to listen to music while driving, listen to music while going for a walk or a run, and that's where the value was amplified. And again, whether it's you're creating a new invention, you're selling any product or service, the whole concept is there are plenty of jobs to be done. I could use a reel-to-reel, I could use a tape deck, I could use a Walkman. Which is the one that's going to add the most value to what I'm doing?
Okay,
all right.
So next,
go for it.
The next big thing was digital music. So we're moving on now from music playback based on physical properties such as tape magnetization or grooves in a disc of plastic, and we're now moving to ones and zeros to make up digital music. And so the first stop there really was the computer sound card. So this is a Sound Blaster, which was one of the most popular brands of sound card at the time. And these appeared in around the 70s, well, early examples of this. And interfaced with a computer to produce sound, which was used for games, computer programs, and something called MIDI music, which is a simple digital music format. And if you know the game Doom, if you've heard that music before, that's an example of MIDI music. And it wasn't analog anymore, and everything was handled digitally now.
Yeah, and I think it's often overlooked as a major crossing point or a major innovation in the movement of music into new technologies. But this is really the bridge that we had a processor in the computer. It processed digital ones and zeros, and that turned into basically vibrations of a membrane that made air move, and that's what we would hear. And if you go all the way back to things like the wax cylinders and the LPs, that amplification was made physically. Something physically was making the movement. Now we were processing it. And I think that really does now open up so much more things can happen because of it. But oftentimes I don't know that as we're streaming music in our car or off of our phone, I don't know that we necessarily think about the old school Sound Blaster cards. And if anyone's old enough to remember setting up video games back in this era, the settings process was always, what sound card do you have? And you had to choose all these different things to make the noise work on your computer game. And sometimes you didn't have the right drivers, you didn't have the right sound cards, and you would have to pick other sound cards that maybe had crossovers and it might actually work. It was a really complicated process because we didn't have anything normalized yet. And that's also part of innovation, kind of these things that we wanted to bring in and show you, bringing them because they're really critically important. There was a lot of spent energy to make things as simple as you pick up your Android phone or your iPhone, you download the Spotify app, you pick a song, and you play it.
Yeah, today it's all handled in our computers and our phones, right on the motherboards. No need for a separate card anymore. But yeah, there's a lot of work had to be done in those years to even invent the card and invent that sort of interface, and nowadays bake it onto into every piece of electronic.
Yeah, it's so ubiquitous now. You don't need these large pieces, and I think again that's one of the things we want to highlight throughout this series of innovation and technology is how we tend to celebrate the major milestones, and we often forget where we came from. But I mean, really, what's happening now is all of these transistors and resistors and capacitors and chips. We've all just figured out a way to condense that into something that takes up, like 1/10 of 1 millimeter now. And that's the importance of this process of innovation is we keep making things slightly better, slightly more efficient, slightly faster, slightly higher fidelity. But over time, it adds up to these major moments and innovations. And as we get to things like digital streaming music, we're going to see how it's not only impacting our lifestyles, but it's going to impact how we count things. Like, how do you count a record sale when no one actually buys a physical media disc anymore? It's changing the way we have to calculate things of popularity, of sales. And I think that's what's really important about studying the past, is so that we can really see that the things that are happening to us have all kind of been set in motion. From our case now, we're starting whenever we started with LPs in the 20s and 30s. This is all in motion, and all of it only exists because it made a step forward in adding additional value.
Exactly. Yeah, just like in the data episode, talking about the introduction of floppy disks and things like that, popularizing the entire computer industry. The invention of that media had sort of a snowball effect and, changed the way a lot of things in the world work, just like things like streaming have changed the entire music industry and made music accessible for so many more people.
Yeah, and I guess let's talk about one of those other digital medias, and I think this was again for me, this was a major moment, was the compact disc. It was still digital, but it was now a bit more accessible and user friendly than having to decide what settings on my sound card. This became standard.
Yeah, much like Peter's story at the beginning about owning his first record. That's very much my story, with probably that exact disc.
Really? Wow.
As a kid, having my own binder of CDs to pick through and put on in the car was just like so huge, and to have a digital format now for everybody to use that's even more portable and even smaller, at least in one dimension, more storable. Was gigantic. So CDs released in 1982, held about 80 minutes of audio and replaced tapes almost completely when they came out. Much higher fidelity and clarity than a cassette. No tape hiss. Just lots and lots of benefits.
Yeah, and for the most part, it won't degrade the way a tape would. Over time, that magnetic media gets rubbed off. I mean, it's literally magnetic metal particles and on plastic media, and as it runs over a playhead, it degrades over time. CDs, we're supposed to not do that. They do. If you've ever had a CD, they kind of start to degrade. You can scratch them. Lots of things can happen. But overall, the concept is, as long as the reading device can pick up the digital ones and zeros, you get an identical listening experience today that you did when you got this. I don't know when that came out, 1990. I'm going to say 95, somewhere in that time frame. Right. It's just a guess, but we'll say somewhere in that time frame. But yeah,
here's a particularly well-loved example. You can see lots of scratches on the back, maybe. But the next format we're going to talk about sort of fixed that, but it was all sort of too little, too late.
Yeah, and Sony is a highly innovative company, and we're going to talk about them in our video episode because they tried some innovative things with video. They've definitely tried some things with audio. We showed you their memory format, the memory stick. They tried a lot, and we have a lot of things where it's like, you know what, it just didn't work out. And eventually, we're going to get to one where Sony, they did great. But this is one, I liked this format. The mini disc format I thought was an excellent format. Recordable, you had a lot of the portability, you had a little bit more durability. It was easier to record on, but it just never really took off. So talk about the mini disc, Derek.
Yeah, so the mini disc was released about 10 years later in 1992. It's much more compact and durable. It's got this plastic casing around an optical disc, just like the CD, and it held anywhere from around 74 to 320 minutes, depending on the quality of the audio recorded. But it was coming out right at the end of the
the era was getting replaced with new compressed formats like MP3.
Yeah.
So while you had the ability to still be portable, much like the Walkman, so these are both actually Sony Walkman formats, similar size, but now you were able to record digitally as opposed to with magnetic media and an analog format. You could put in track names, you could put in text, you could skip to tracks. Really a wonderful ecosystem. But much like when we talked about the reel-to-reel, a wonderful recording format, wonderful for listening, just never really got the commercial connection like a compact disc where artists and musicians were not putting out commercially made content in a wide degree on this format. And I think that's the big issue that really hit the mini disc. Was it was a fine format, but just commercially, if you weren't making the content, there was not a whole lot of stuff that you could get to put on your own mini disc player.
Yeah, and that was very much in part due to the release of MP3 in 1991.
Yep.
So just around the same time. And while storage media, like we discussed, was still very small at the time, which meant you could fit any MP3s in a portable format, it still was miles better than mini disc, and it was still completely digital and no longer physical at all. So these weren't, you couldn't touch an MP3. And they used new kinds of compression, so you could fit more songs in a smaller space. And it's definitely the most popular audio format of the era.
Yeah, and an era that really took commercial music to a whole new level. And we have a device that I think really changed a lot of that with MP3s, which was that the iPod really made commercial music and the portable player a big thing.
Oh yeah. So I mean, the release of the iPod was hugely crucial to MP3's success. There were a lot of other MP3 players at the time, but iPod really got it right and marketed it so well. This is a later iPod that had 128 gigabytes, so thousands of songs that you could store in zero space, essentially.
Yeah, and one of the big things that, and I talk about this in one of the classes, I don't know if you've taken it with me yet, but I talk about how the job to be done, listening to music, MP3s, playing an MP3, could have been done. There were Cabo players, Rio players that were invented earlier than this, but iPod took over, and much of it, I believe, was due to iTunes. And I very rarely see people talk about how massively important iTunes was, but the ecosystem that Apple, iPod, iTunes created was still got the job done for the listener. You could access content, you could put it on your portable player, you had a safe, secure environment to buy those songs. 99 cents was the number that they went with. But for the studios and the artists, what iTunes gave them, digital rights management. So this was where the era of Napster and all the torrents and downloading became normalized, and we created a normal marketplace. And because iPod had a marketplace for this, I think iTunes is what made the iPod have that extra value over one of the other sources, because one of the other sources you would either have to own a CD like this Nirvana CD, pull that content off onto your computer and then replace it onto your Cabo or Rio player, versus iTunes, you could log on your computer, download the song, put it right onto your device. And it was convenient and safe for you, but it was also convenient and safe for the artists themselves. And I think that's one of the reasons why iPod is synonymous with digital music player, is because of that additional value they created by having a safe, secure, and accepted by the artist marketplace to buy music.
Yeah, it just made things so much simpler and sort of made the transition to MP3s that much better. You didn't have to go to the store or mail order albums anymore. You can do it right from your home.
Yeah.
And another thing that started around the same time that also brought sort of this explosion of ease of use was streaming. So that started in the late 90s. But the internet was still, very slow, and the infrastructure really wasn't there yet. And it only really became more popular and dominant in the last decade.
Yeah, and now it's so prevalent that there's so many different places you can listen to music, whether it's Apple Music, Spotify, podcasting sources. So it's become almost the natural way that we interact and engage with recorded audio, particularly music, but podcasts and other recorded formats. And it became so much the standard, and it became really quickly that it's now forced us to rethink, how do we even calculate what is a high quality, high selling record or album or CD, because people don't typically buy physical media anymore. They consume through either paid subscriptions or free access through streaming, that we've now had to recalculate things like what is the standard for selling 100,000 albums now, because no one buys albums.
Yeah. I mean, I know for me, I held off for a long time. And the changes Peter's talking about have only like sort of affected the industry most recently, because I held off for a long time, and I know a lot of people did too, and a lot of people still are in subscribing to a streaming platform. I had all the music I wanted. I had all my CDs ripped and saved on my hard drive, this phone, actually, my iPhone 5, had my entire music library on it, and why would I want anything different? But I finally caved and got a subscription to Spotify a few years ago, and it's the convenience is just unparalleled. Being able to look up any song you want, any song that's stuck in your head, and just have it for. I mean, my friends and I have a family plan, and it's about $3 a month.
Yeah, it's remarkable what that accessibility has now meant. So when you were on your iPhone 5, it was accessing your owned media. And now it's accessing any media almost ever created.
Yeah.
And that is, again, giving us more accessibility, more openness to explore, try new things, but just having everything at your fingertips also seems to be like, I could see a possible negative to that, of how do you value music, right? So when I told you back to my first 45 Devo Whippet, that was a thing that really mattered to me. But when you can have any song at any time from any era, there's nothing really worth carving your name into in 2022. It doesn't mean that it's a better or worse time. It just means that we see how this changes not only how we listen to music, but it changes us quite a bit.
Yeah, that feeling of going and getting that new album you've heard about may be gone, but yeah, I mean, I still find ways to do that and recreate that myself. Like, this is a cassette from my personal collection. I like going to thrift stores and secondhand stores and finding albums I like, just as an experience. Maybe I don't even listen to cassettes that often, but it's still that feeling. Yeah,
and to me, it's it wasn't better or worse at any different point in time. We had things and we interacted with them, and as time changes, we change with time. We change the way we listen to these things. I have listened to music off of these reel-to-reels, through Walkman of different varieties, all the way through Spotify streaming and those kinds of things now. And I think it's an amazing opportunity that we have to not only be able to enjoy what technology and innovation brings to us, but hopefully you're valuing the lessons that we can learn as we look back and we see how these innovations aren't just about making higher fidelity. And it's not even just about having something that is functionally better, but things like the 8-track was not necessarily functionally better than the cassette that came out at the same time, but it had industry partners like Ford that was putting these into vehicles, which made it more visible and accessible to the public, which made it a bit more commercially successful. There's going to be lessons that people are going to learn through this. Sony is one. We're going to see a similar issue happen in the video with VHS versus beta. But when we get to video games, we're going to get to the Blu-ray versus the HD DVD. And that also was a video format, but it was really the Sony PlayStation that brought that accessibility, much like 8-track and Ford Mustang. Sony really picked up and made that happen with this format.
Yeah, I mean, much like the Sony Walkman was a huge factor in popularizing cassettes,
right.
And how what was it? The iPod was hugely popular in popularizing MP3s.
Yeah, I agree. Right. So there's the form, there's the function, but ultimately, how does it create value? So we'll be back in Series 3. In the third part of this series, we're going to look at video and visual. Is that correct?
Yes.
All right, good. So hopefully you're enjoying this. If you have questions, comments, concerns, drop them in YouTube. If there's things that you didn't see, maybe we'll come back and do a refresh for things that we forgot, like I forgot the LPs to bring them in. Sorry. But there may be some things and lessons that you might be able to teach us. So if you have any comments or things that you think are important, please feel free to share. That is one of the benefits of being in this 21st century digital media, is you can actually give us feedback as we produce this content as well. So thanks for joining us again. Derek, I'll leave any final words to you, as this is also part of your hobby and your interest. We'll leave the last words for you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, just again, it's a great opportunity to show all this stuff off, and just to educate people on the journey when maybe we've sort of forgotten it in the modern day with all the conveniences. And just thanks for tuning in and watching.
Thanks again. We'll see you next time.